In London, the British Foreign Secretary, Sir Anthony Eden, faced outraged members of Parliament.
Does the right honourable gentleman think that there is anything to be gained by covering up the fact that an ally of ours is both deporting and shooting nationalists and socialists in Poland?
By late September, the underground could no longer go on. Starvation was setting in. People were drinking from puddles. Every dog and horse in the city had been eaten.
There was nothing to eat. I was hunting cats.
After 63 days of fighting, on October 2nd, it was over. Realizing that help from the Soviets was a lost cause, underground leaders surrendered and agreed to evacuate Warsaw. Nearly 3/4 of the underground army had perished. Those who survived remember the surrender well.
It was the worst moment of my life, to be surrounded by Germans and taken back into captivity after 2 months of freedom.
Despair. But we knew that the road ahead of us is not easy. So you did not allow yourself to sit down and cry. This was considered unpatriotic, and weaklings were doing that, but not us, you know.
As the surviving soldiers of the underground army marched out of Warsaw to be deported to POW camps, even the Germans admired their courage. One German officer wrote home, "In truth, they fought better than we did." By the end, well over 200,000 people died in the Warsaw Uprising, most of them civilians. 500,000 others were driven out as refugees. On Hitler's orders, the city that had defied the Nazis was reduced to rubble. The Soviet generals across the river watched.
Nobody had dreamed that the Red Army would be stopped in the suburbs of an Allied capital and would watch that capital being destroyed.
But worse was to come.
Prime Minister Churchill confers with Premier Stalin in Moscow.
Barely 10 days after the underground surrender, Churchill traveled to Moscow to meet with Stalin. He brought along Poland's premier in exile, supposedly to negotiate Poland's post-war boundaries with the Soviets.
When the Polish premier began to negotiate, as he thought he'd been encouraged to do, Molotov interrupted him and said, "What's all this? Mr. Churchill here settled all these matters at Tehran a year ago. Now, what are you wasting our time trying to negotiate some stupid compromise?" And the Polish Prime Minister was absolutely thunderstruck. And he turned to Churchill and said, "Is that true?" And Churchill, according to the minute, hung his head and after a brief silence said, "Yes, it's true." And that was the time when the Poles realized that they really had been sold down the river.
Days before, in Washington, President Roosevelt, getting ready for an election just weeks away, posed in front of a map of pre-war Poland with Polish-American leaders. The implication? He would be the protector of Poland's pre-war boundaries. Unbeknownst to them, he had already agreed to cede a third of Poland's territory to the Soviets.
Victory in Europe brought wild rejoicing throughout the Allied world as the Big Three announced the downfall of Nazi Germany.
The Allied victory in Europe came in May 1945, in the Pacific a few months later.
It's a great day as a thankful people let loose their...
But Poland remained occupied by Soviet troops, and the underground soldiers who made it to the West were in for a shock. In the victory parades, there was no place for them. The Allies had recognized the Warsaw pro-communist regime installed by Stalin as the official government of Poland.
We fought for 5 years in the underground, but the only ones allowed into the victory parade in London were the Moscow Poles.
I remember I was crying in 1946 in London. Units of Fiji were parading and Poles were not allowed.
So and we knew that the whole effort, thousands and thousands of people that died in the name of freedom, in vain. You cannot help but feel bitter. So our story was forgotten.
Forgotten for many reasons. For the Western Allies, the story of the underground fighting for Warsaw alone was an embarrassment. For the Soviets, it was inconvenient. In Warsaw, there would be no official monument erected to the underground fighters until 1989. The end of World War II marked the beginning of 44 long years of Soviet repression in Poland. For many of those who survived it, the story of the Warsaw Uprising is one of betrayal, great powers abandoning a staunch ally. Historians, however, disagree about its legacy. Some say Roosevelt and Churchill went as far as they could pressing Stalin, given that they counted on his Red Army to keep doing the lion's share of the fighting and the dying.
If you ask who won the war, if you mean who paid the greatest price in blood and treasure to defeat Nazi Germany, the answer is the Soviet Union.
Others say Roosevelt in particular was short-sighted, that the loss of Warsaw paved the way for the tragedy of the Cold War.
And I don't think Roosevelt went beyond the notion, let's defeat the Nazis, and that's it. To defeat Nazism while, with considerable indifference, handing over half of Europe to Stalin was a major compromise of principle, which proved historically costly.
There are monuments now in Warsaw, as the last generation of those who fought is dying out. To some, the uprising was about courage in the face of terrible odds. To others, it was naive, even folly. But to those who were there, it was simply inevitable. When you look back on it now with the advantage of history, was it worth it?
Always. You know, it was, you know, in accordance with Polish history. It was in accordance with Polish attitudes. It was according with Polish soul and heart.
The Warsaw Uprising, though unsuccessful, set a powerful example for future generations. Back in the 1980s, I watched young Poles paint this symbol of the uprising as graffiti during the rise of the Solidarity trade union. Their peaceful protest led to the end of communism and a free Polish nation, the one their grandparents fought for back in 1944. For CNN Presents, I'm David Ensor in Warsaw. Good night.
CNN Presents brings you the world. Week after week, storytelling that separates fact from fiction. CNN Presents, daring to look below the surface.
This is the death chamber.
At the most compelling issues of our times.
We will remain in Iraq as long as necessary, and not a day more.
The award-winning documentary series, CNN Presents, Sunday 8 Eastern on CNN.